My life was on a steady, predictable course that I had carefully built. Growing up in a small town with big dreams, I knew what I wanted: to settle down, raise a family, and work with my hands. Becoming a mechanic felt natural, fueled by my weekends spent in my dad's garage, fixing up old cars. Those moments shaped my future, though the road wasn't always easy. Heather had been central to that dream. She was the girl I admired from afar in high school, someone who seemed untouchable. When we finally got together, I was determined to make it work. We made big plans, buying a house, starting a family. But life had other ideas, and cracks began to show. Now, sitting in my flatbed truck, I stared at the old trailer up ahead. I'd been sitting here for almost 20 minutes, lost in thought. The mailbox still had Prentice on it, but the driveway was empty where my car used to be. If Heather still lived here, she'd be at work. A part of me wondered what car might pull in later. It wouldn't be Drake's. He thought too highly of himself for this side of town. Anger bubbled up, and I almost left. I asked myself again why I took this delivery, coming back after swearing I'd never return. But just as I was about to go, I spotted a swing set and sandbox filled with toys. That hit me hard, and I blinked back tears. Polly would be almost 4 now, my daughter I hadn't seen in years. I remembered the last time I was here, 2 years ago on July 3rd. That day changed everything. Heather and I argued over a party I refused to go to. That fight marked the end of my life as I knew it. I hadn't been back since. We'd been saving for a house in Cayman Estates, dreaming of a perfect future. But we were young and in love, swept up in the fantasy. Heather worked as a receptionist for a construction company, and I was a master mechanic at the Ford dealership. At 24, I was the youngest, but fully trained with a good salary. Together, we saved money every paycheck. Heather had always been popular, cheerleader, majorette, always dating the star athletes. She was beautiful and well-known, always surrounded by attention. I finally met her by chance when she came to buy a car with her dad, Walter MacArthur, a wealthy man in town. Heather was turning 18 and picking out her birthday car. She was stunning, and when she checked out a Mustang convertible, I decided not to miss my chance to say hello. When she looked up, I smiled and asked, "Need any help?" She mistook me for a salesman and pointed to her dad. "He wants me to get a sedan, but I really like this one. How much more is it?" "It's about the same since his choice has all the options. This one's stripped down to lower the price, but it has more power and looks way better. Just tell him the price is the same and see what he says." "What's missing?" she asked. "No power seats, no satellite radio, no leather, and no extra features. But it has what you need: air, power steering, windows, and locks." She thought for a moment, then walked back to her dad. After talking to him, she returned. "The Focus is more practical, and I like the extras. The convertible's cute, but not for me." I agreed. We chatted, and I introduced myself as a mechanic. She smiled and said her name was Heather. After some more conversation, I asked her out, and to my surprise, she said yes. That started the best summer of my life. We dated throughout the summer and fall. Heather chose to attend a tech school for nursing instead of college, despite her parents' objections. She got her license, checked out hospital jobs, but ended up working fewer hours for better pay at a construction company. After 6 months, she moved into an apartment with a friend, wanting independence. Her dad told me they were disappointed, but Heather insisted they spend money on themselves now. We kept dating, though not exclusively. Heather wasn't ready for a serious commitment and wanted to stay a maid until she found the one. I hoped that would be me, but I didn't push it. Over time, she started seeing other guys less, and I was ready to propose. I made an offer on a double-wide trailer in a nice park just outside of town. Once it was mine, I moved in, planning to surprise Heather with a proposal. That evening, I went to her apartment, only to see her getting out of a car with Drake Cunningham, a coworker from the construction site. I watched from my car as they walked to her door. She had never let me come up after dates, saying her roommate wouldn't like it. At the door, she and Drake exchanged words, and then he pulled her close. I almost jumped out of the car, but waited, when she kissed him back and let his hand roam. I felt sick. I approached them, and when she saw me, she pushed Drake away. I didn't let her speak. I grabbed Drake, punched him in the mouth, and watched him stumble back, bleeding. Heather screamed and rushed to comfort him, cradling his head in her lap. I stood there, furious, watching her comfort Drake as he bled. I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled the ring box from my pocket and threw it at her. I didn't care about giving it to her anymore. I just needed something to throw. As it bounced off her shoulder, I spat. "I almost made the biggest mistake of my life. I hope you get what you want, but it's not me." On the verge of tears, I ran back to my car, slammed on the gas, and sped away. Back at my trailer, I sat in the dark, overwhelmed by anger and hurt, trying to figure out how I'd been so wrong about her. I thought she loved me like I loved her, but what I saw said otherwise. I finally went to bed around dawn, exhausted, and slept until noon. It was Sunday, and with Heather gone, I had nothing to do. After a shower, I felt some relief, but while standing under the hot water, I suddenly felt her presence behind me. She had slipped into the shower, wrapping her arms around me. I pushed her away, turned off the water, and yelled, "What are you doing? I saw you with Drake. He had his hands all over you, and you didn't stop him." She stood defiant, smiling slightly. "You didn't see everything. I told him it wasn't going to happen between us, and he was angry. I was just trying to get inside to end it when you showed up." "That's a lie," I said. "I saw you kiss him and hold on to him. If you wanted him, you could have just told me. I would have backed off even though it would hurt." "You're wrong, Jesse," she insisted. "You're the only one I want. If I can't convince you with words, then take me now. Make me yours." I hesitated, torn between desire and the memories of her saying she wanted to save herself for marriage. Could I trust her after what I saw? Had my intervention stopped something worse? Or was she telling the truth? I looked at her pleading face and made a decision. I told her I believed her, but I couldn't take her offer, knowing what it meant to her. She smiled and left. That evening, I still planned to propose, though doubts lingered about where she'd spent the night. I silenced them when I arrived at her place. She said yes, and I forgot everything else. We married, she moved into the trailer, and we started saving for a house. Heather got pregnant a year later, and Polly was born 9 months after that. Heather returned to work 6 months later, and we continued saving. I worked overtime whenever I could, and we were finally close to having enough for a down payment. Polly, now 2, needed her own room, and I was excited about our future. We were just waiting for the right house to become available. I was exhausted and didn't have the energy for going out, but I thought Heather understood. We had a few arguments, but she usually backed down, knowing we were saving for our dream home. She occasionally went out with her friends, and while I didn't love it, I couldn't complain since she always came home early. That changed the day before July 4th. After working extra hours, all I wanted was a hot shower, a cold beer, and to relax with my family for the weekend. When I got home around 4, Heather's car was already there. I grabbed a beer and headed to the deck, ready to unwind. As I relaxed, Heather came out dressed to go out, which surprised me. I also realized Polly wasn't around. "Where's Polly and why are you dressed up?" I asked, not fully processing what was happening. Heather crossed her arms. "Polly's at Mom's for the night. We're going to a party at the park. The company's hosting it for the fireworks. There are seats for employees and their families. We need to hurry." "I told you I wanted to stay home and rest," I replied. "I'm exhausted from working overtime, and I can't stand your work crowd, especially Drake. I never get to go out anymore. You work all the time, and we barely see you. We haven't even been physical engaged in weeks. I want to go out tonight, and I'm going with or without you." "Fine, but I'm not going to that party. We can go to dinner or watch fireworks from the river like we used to." "No, I want to be with my friends tonight, whether you come or not," she shot back. "I'm going. Don't wait up." With that, Heather left, and I stayed behind, angry and frustrated. I wasn't going to chase her, and I wasn't about to spend time with Drake and his crowd. I went inside, had something to eat, but the emptiness I felt wasn't hunger. It was the absence of my wife and daughter. The evening I'd hoped would be relaxing turned into a lonely one. I eventually lay down on the couch and fell asleep. I woke up around 8:30 to fireworks and realized I was still alone. After taking the shower I had wanted earlier, I decided to head to Towner's Bar and Grill, where I knew Heather would be. The thought of her with Drake made me uneasy, so I felt I had to go. I arrived close to 10 o'clock and ran into Janie and Jake Cummings outside. When I asked if they'd seen Heather, they exchanged nervous glances. Jake warned me that Drake was making a move on her, and she wasn't pushing him away like usual. His guys were keeping her friends at a distance. Inside, I spotted Heather and Drake sitting close together, his hand under the table. Heather looked drunk. I walked up and yelled, "Heather, what are you doing with this guy? Let's go home." Before I could react, 2 men grabbed me and Drake punched me in the face. I saw stars, nearly collapsing as they held me up. Heather just watched, smiling faintly. Fueled by anger, I kicked Drake in the face, but another guy took his place and kept slapping me until I passed out. When I woke up, I was in my car, covered in blood, with bruised ribs and an aching body. A man nearby told me to leave, saying Heather belonged to Drake for the night and threatening me if I returned. Realizing I had no chance, I drove home, showered again, and stared at my battered reflection in the mirror. Sitting in my living room, I reflected on the night. Heather had always agreed to avoid these company parties because of Drake, and she knew I needed rest after all my overtime. But tonight, she went out anyway and sided with Drake. When I came to bring her home, she stood by as I was knocking. My anger grew. I considered getting a weapon or sneaking into Drake's place later, but both options would land me in jail. Neither was worth it. I had no choice but to wait for Heather to come home before deciding my next move. Divorce seemed like the best option, but it had serious downsides. First, I'd be labeled a betrayed and everyone in town would know. Second, with her family's money, I'd risk losing everything, including custody of Polly. I couldn't stay and face that humiliation. Divorce was out, at least for now. As the sun came up, it became clear Heather had spent the night with Drake. No calls, no explanation. There was no doubt what had happened. Worse, no one in town had helped me, proving that Drake had control, and I meant nothing to anyone, including my wife. With that realization, I made my decision. I wouldn't divorce her because that would free her to be with Drake and risk him getting custody of Polly. No, they'd have to live in sin, and Polly would remain my daughter, even if I couldn't see her. I left Heather the money we'd saved for the house, and I planned to send half of my salary monthly to support Polly. This way, Heather could never claim I abandoned them or didn't provide for my child. If she filed for divorce, I'd fight for custody, but in the meantime, I'd do my duty as a father until Polly was grown. An hour later, I left town. My heart was broken and I was hurting, but I couldn't stay and face further humiliation. Heather had made her choice, and now I was making mine, leaving her to explain to our daughter why I wasn't there anymore. After driving all day, I stopped at a motel for the night, then continued the next morning. My body ached and my head pounded, but by the third day, I was 1,000 miles away. In a new town, I found a free clinic and got checked out. I had a mild concussion, cracked ribs, and bruises, but I'd live. I asked the doctor if he knew where a master mechanic could find work, and he referred me to Josh Fields, a custom car dealer. I was lucky to land the job. Josh sold luxury cars and needed someone with my skills to restore and resell them. We hit it off, and he paid me well for my expertise. At the end of that first month, I cashed my check, kept a third, and mailed the rest to Heather, ensuring it couldn't be traced back to me. I repeated this every 2 weeks for the next 2 years, each time sending more money from different locations, making sure I couldn't be found. After the first envelope, which included a note explaining my reasons for leaving and that the money was for Polly, I never added anything else. Just cash. I made it clear that the money was for my daughter's care, ensuring I wasn't abandoning my responsibilities. I found a small, affordable place near work and gradually furnished it with secondhand items. It became a cozy bachelor pad, and I started my new life, determined to change things. I remembered my failure to defend myself that night, so I joined a martial arts class, training hard to ensure I could protect myself next time. I also took the car-related courses Josh recommended, learning that foreign cars were mostly hype, and I often saved Josh money by using equivalent parts. Josh and I became good friends, and he trusted me with deliveries, knowing I could talk to buyers and explain their car's features. Customers liked me, and it helped both Josh and me. Over time, I made new friends and started going out more. One bar I frequented had a group of women who came regularly. After a while, I introduced myself to Sean, a beautiful redhead. We had a lot in common, both dealing with difficult marriages. Her husband had left her, and she was waiting for the legal time to divorce. At first, I told Sean I was separated, but eventually I opened up about Heather and Polly. Sean understood, and she introduced me to her 2-year-old son, Bill. We started dating and things got serious. I was happy with her and her son, enjoying their company and letting the relationship grow naturally. We shared many conversations and soon became physical engaged. Our time together was sweet, and I realized I had never felt this way before, not even with Heather. We spent more time together, and when Billy stayed with friends, Sean would stay over. Those nights were some of the best I'd ever had, filled with love, conversation, and companionship. One day after a night with Sean, I realized just how deeply I cared for her. That's when I realized it was truly over with Heather. A few weeks later, Josh had a Mercedes sedan from Germany that needed delivering. I worked on it, added an air conditioner, tuned the engine, and made sure it was in top condition. Josh asked if I wanted to handle the delivery, a 3-day trip. and I agreed since Sean was visiting her mother for a week. I missed her and Billy, so this seemed like a good distraction, plus there was a bonus. I didn't pay much attention to the destination at first, but when I saw it was my old town, the place I fled from, it hit me. Did I really want to go back? My life was good now with Sean and my job, and I had nearly forgotten the pain Heather caused. But I decided it was time to face it and see my daughter. It was also time to finalize my divorce. I left the next day, uncertain about my emotions. When I arrived, I delivered the car to Carl Cunningham, the owner of the construction company and Drake's father. He didn't know who I was. I pushed down my anger, knowing Carl was probably unaware of what kind of person his son was. Carl's estate was huge, and after I arrived, I backed the car off the flatbed. He inspected it, we took a test drive, and I gave him the paperwork. During the process, he mentioned the car was a gift for Drake, who was trying to impress a woman. He casually mentioned she was married, but her husband had left, and Drake was spending all his time with her. I kept quiet, realizing it was Heather he was talking about. Carl seemed like a decent man, unaware of what his son was up to. He thought Drake was doing right by this woman, not knowing the full story. I nodded along, keeping my thoughts to myself, and we completed the deal. He gave me a cashier's check, and I left. On impulse, I drove to my old neighborhood and parked near my old trailer. I sat there, unsure of what to do next, with a lot on my mind. Now it seemed that with me gone, Drake had finally gotten his way with Heather. Maybe he didn't need to get her drunk after all, and maybe that night wasn't the first time. What I thought was too much drinking could have been her doing what she wanted all along. 2 years later, I sat there, facing my past, trying not to let it overwhelm me. Seeing the swing set and toys brought back painful memories. I had a panic attack, sweating, flushed, and struggling to breathe. I calmed myself with deep breaths and focused on technical thoughts to regain control. Just as I relaxed, her van drove by and pulled into the driveway. It was the same old Toyota with the same license plate. I slumped down in the truck so she wouldn't notice me. Heather got out and walked inside without looking around, seeming in good spirits. I wondered if she was working, though I doubted she needed to, given the money I sent her. A few minutes later, her mother's Mercedes pulled up, and I watched as Grace helped Polly out of the car. My heart ached as I saw my daughter rush inside. I stayed parked for another 20 minutes, watching Polly come out to play on the swing with another little girl. It hit me hard how much I missed her. She had grown so much in the 2 years I'd been gone. Driving away from her again seemed impossible. Tears filled my eyes as I drove to a Motel 6 and checked in with cash, avoiding credit cards that could be traced. I wasn't ready for Drake or anyone to know I was back in town, but maybe that would change. The pain of losing my daughter and my place in her life weighed heavily on me. In the motel room, my humiliation replayed in my mind, fueling my anger. By 10 that night, I couldn't hold back anymore and gave in to the fire burning inside me. I drove to Towner's Bar and Grill, knowing Drake and his crew would likely be there. Spotting them at a table in the back, I felt a surge of anticipation, easing the pain that had been gnawing at me. The bar was quiet, which worked in my favor. I ordered a beer and watched Drake's table through the mirror behind the bar, waiting. Soon, someone pointed me out to Drake, and I saw him glance my way. I smiled, knowing things were about to unfold. My martial arts training had taught me 2 key lessons: patience and how to use anger as a controlled tool. I had been nursing that anger ever since Carl mentioned Drake and Heather. Now it burned white-hot in my chest, fueling my resolve. Drake sent one of his guys over first. The man placed a hand on my shoulder and sneered. "Aren't you the chicken who ran off, leaving your wife and kid? Jesse Chicken Prentice, right?" Without putting down my beer, I turned and smiled. "That's me. What can I do for you?" He laughed and returned to Drake, who stood up and headed my way. I set my beer down and readied myself, feet firmly planted. Position and anticipation were everything in a confrontation, and I was ready. Looking over my shoulder at the bartender, I said, "Make sure you remember who starts this, Jim. I'm not looking for trouble, but I want a witness." Jim nodded. "I hear you, Jesse. Just be careful." "Count on it," I replied, closing my eyes and focusing on my training. My sensei's words echoed in my head. "Don't think, just let your body act." It was time to do just that. There were 4 of them, just like that night when my life changed. My training with my sensei had focused on reactive defense, using the opponent's anger and actions against them. My sensei said I was good at it, and now I had to prove it in the real world. As Drake and his crew approached, I sat quietly at the bar, arms relaxed, my back against the counter. My mind was clear, but my anger burned hot, ready for the moment. Drake stopped just out of reach and sneered, taunting me about Heather. Well, if it isn't the coward who ran off and let me have his wife. She's been mine, Jesse. You weren't here to stop me. I said nothing, watching him, waiting. His words fanned my inner fire, but I stayed in control, focused. One of his men was the only real threat. The others were just background noise. Drake continued. Why don't you run back to your hole? Heather's with me now, and there's nothing you can do. His words stung, but I realized he might be telling the truth. This was his territory. But I wouldn't let him win. I damped down my anger, knowing it was time to push his buttons. You're delusional, Drake. Heather always had better taste. She pitied you. Nothing more. You're just a loser who needs backup to get a woman. Do you need your boys to help in bed too? His face twisted in anger, just as I'd hoped. He grabbed my collar and I let him pull me forward, using the momentum to push him backward. He lost his balance and slammed the floor hard, dazed. His buddies hesitated, unsure of what to do. Two of them pulled Drake up, his face red with fury. I knew then that the fight was over. I had him. Drake charged at me, arms out, trying to grab me. I sidestepped, grabbed his arm, and yanked him toward the bar. His face slammed into the edge with a sickening crunch. He crumpled to the floor in a pool of blood, his nose broken, teeth scattered, and his shoulder likely dislocated. I didn't focus on Drake. I kept my eyes on the others. The man I had been watching cursed and stepped forward, pulling back his arm to throw a punch. He was the one who had threatened me before, the one who laughed about Heather being with Drake. I wasn't just going to stop him, I was going to make sure he paid. He threw a punch, but I dodged, letting him hit nothing. He quickly swung again, and this time I grabbed his arm and twisted, letting my weight pull down. His arm hit the stool, and I heard a loud snap, followed by his scream. His arm had broken below the elbow. As he staggered back, I struck him hard in the chest and followed with a kick to the groin, knocking him out cold. Just to make sure, I kicked him in the head and stomped on his groin a few times. Goodbye to your family jewels, I thought. My sensei would have been proud, though I resisted the urge to eliminate him. 2 down, 2 left. The others were more cautious now, trying to flank me. They were scared but had no choice but to face me. I closed my eyes, sensing their next move. As they came at me, I grabbed both by the heads and slammed them together. They dropped to the floor, unconscious. With all 4 down, I walked over to Drake and kicked him between the legs, just for good measure. He didn't react, but it felt satisfying. I returned to the bar, took a sip of my beer, and savored the moment. I hadn't even broken a sweat. Jim, the bartender, stared at me in shock. Jesse, I've never seen anything like that. How did you do that? They didn't stand a chance. His words reignited my anger, not toward Drake, but toward the town that stood by and did nothing when I needed help. I turned to Jim, who had watched it all unfold 2 years ago. Just like that night, right, Jim? No one helped me. Not you, not my so-called friends, not even my wife. Well, I'll never let that happen again. Tell everyone to stay away from me unless I allow it, or they'll regret it. Now I'm leaving. Tell the cops what happened and tell the truth, or I'll be back, and you won't like it. Jim muttered, Where are you going, Jesse? What should I tell them? I'll be at the Motel 6. I'm leaving tomorrow at dawn, so if they want to talk, tell them to hurry. With that, I left the bar and returned to the motel. I expected to feel victorious after confronting Drake and his gang, but instead I felt empty. His taunts about Heather still stung, reopening the wounds I thought had healed. My revenge felt hollow, and the pain of Heather's betrayal and losing my daughter flooded back. I sat in the motel room, replaying that night from 2 years ago. Why did I run? I had my reasons, but deep down, I always knew the truth. My marriage was over the moment Heather chose Drake. Still, it didn't ease the pain of losing my daughter. As I sat there, lost in thought, a knock came at the door. Expecting the police, I opened it, but it was Jake Cummings. He had been the one who warned me that night. I nodded and let him in, grateful that at least he had tried to do something. Hello, Jake. Long time no see. How have you and Janie been? We're okay. I figured it didn't hurt to be polite since I was leaving the next morning. Jesse, I heard what you did at Towner's. Jim called and told me everything. Have you been home or seen Heather? She's been losing her mind not knowing where you went. She even hired a PI, but no one could find any trace of you. I just stared at him. Why would I have wanted anyone to know where I was? I made sure no one could find me for a reason, so why tell you now? I shook my head and tried to explain. What did you think, Jake? That I'd stay after what she did with Drake? After he and his guys knocked me up while everyone watched, including Heather? I saw the smile on her face when it happened. I knew then it was over. She and this town can have each other. I came back to do a job, and now I'm leaving, back to where I'm respected. Jake listened and shook his head. I didn't care, but I appreciated that he had tried to warn me that night. Jake, you at least tried to help, and I thank you for that. But now I need you to leave me alone. Jake didn't move. I was getting frustrated, ready to point him to the door, when he sat down and said, "No, you're going to hear me out first." "Fine," I sighed. "Say what you need to, and then go." That night, Janie and I tried to get Heather away from Drake. We had the car ready, but she wouldn't come. She said she'd find you and make Drake let you go. That was the last we saw of her. The next day, we found your trailer empty. We tried to reach Heather all day, and when we finally found her, she was a mess. When she couldn't find you, she became hysterical. We had to take her to the hospital for exhaustion. I was surprised, but still firm in my belief that Heather caused this. She was the one who chose Drake that night. Jake continued. After the hospital, Heather quit her job at the construction company and filed a complaint against Drake. He paid her to drop the charges and stay quiet. She took a job at the hospital and never stopped trying to find you. We all felt guilty for not doing more that night. Jake paused before adding, "Heather knows you're back. I told her after Jim called me. She wants to see you but is scared. She knows she messed up and that she's responsible for you leaving and for the knocking you took. She had no intention of staying with Drake. Most of it was bravado. When the fight started, things got out of control, and you were gone before she could do anything." Jake looked uncomfortable as he finished. "She never explained where she went that night, and she never admitted to anything. But we chose to believe her, Jesse. We think you should too." He stood up and headed to the door. "I don't know what to tell you, Jesse. Heather loves you, and Polly misses you. It's up to you now. I wish you the best." I walked him to the door. "I hear you, Jake, and I appreciate it. But she made her choice that night. She knew how I felt about Drake and still went out with him. She defied me and did something no married woman should do. She went to a bar with another man and drank too much. Don't try to make me the bad guy here." Jake looked at me sadly. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. You know her better than anyone. Just be careful and make the right choice for yourself." He left, the door closing with a heavy click in the silence. I sat on the bed, hands in my head, knowing Jake was right, but my anger still burned. I wasn't sure I could ever forgive her, especially not in this town where Drake and his family ruled. Returning here would only bring more trouble, maybe even for me. It was nearly midnight, and I felt restless after the fight. I decided to drive by Cayman Estates, where Heather and I had once dreamed of buying a house. As I drove through the gates, I thought of the plans we had made, decorating a yard for Polly and more kids. All those dreams gone because Heather chose Drake. Tears came as I drove, and I had to pull over until I regained control. The memories of what could have been were painful. This trip hadn't brought closure, just more hurt. I needed to head back to where my real life was now, with Sean and her son, where I had people who cared about me. But I couldn't ignore my love for Polly. I still needed to resolve that, though maybe not tonight. I decided to pack up, leave the motel, and head home. Maybe it was time to file for divorce and let Heather move on with Drake. That thought angered me more. I slammed my fist on the steering wheel. "No, this ends now," I muttered. I turned the truck toward Heather's trailer. It was time to confront her and make some decisions. Pulling up down the street, I saw her van parked there. I turned off the engine, ready to end things once and for all. As I stood there, all my old anger and uncertainty came rushing back. I took a few minutes to regain control, berating myself for being weak. Once I felt calmer, I stepped out of the truck and walked to the door, reminding myself this wasn't my home anymore. The porch needed repairs, but that wasn't my responsibility now. Even though I'd worked hard to buy this place for Heather and Polly, because of Heather's choices, it was falling apart. I knocked, and when the door opened, it wasn't Heather. It was her mother, Grace. I was surprised, as her car wasn't there. "Jesse, is that really you?" she gasped. "Come in. Where have you been? What happened?" Before I could react, Grace pulled me inside. I followed her into the small living room, which I had once been proud of. She motioned for me to sit, and I complied, still processing her presence. Grace never liked me, always thinking Heather married beneath her. Yet here she was, acting glad to see me. "Where's Polly?" I asked. "Is Heather out with Drake? Heard he had an accident?" I couldn't help but snicker, recalling Drake's run-in with the bar. Grace blushed, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to see my daughter and sort things out with Heather. Grace explained, "Heather's out, asked me to watch Polly. She'll be back around midnight." I sarcastically replied, I'm sure Drake's taking good care of her. Heather chose him over me, right? So you must be pleased. Grace's face tightened with anger, but I didn't care. I decided to finish up, see Polly, and leave. Heather had moved on. It was time to make things official. I walked down the hall to Polly's room. She was asleep, holding a blue bunny, her hair spread on the pillow. My heart ached seeing her, and I felt tears well up. I stood there, lost in the moment, until Grace came up behind me, placing a hand on my shoulder. She's missed you, Jessie, almost as much as Heather. You broke their hearts when you left. I turned to look at Grace, who seemed determined to say more. Come back to the living room and hear me out, she said. If you leave after, that's your choice. But if you don't listen, you'll just prove me right about you. I gave Polly one last look and followed her down the hall. I entered the room and sat in the chair I used to watch TV in, ready to listen to Grace. I didn't care about her opinion, never had. I figured she wanted to blame me for everything, so I leaned back and nodded. Go ahead, Grace. You can blame me all you want. I never cared what you thought. Grace frowned, but started speaking. I need to tell you what happened that night and after. You left, and you have no idea what Heather and Polly went through. I'll tell you the truth. I never thought you were right for Heather. I believed she'd choose someone like Drake, rich and from an important family. But she always said she'd rather die than be with someone like him. I laughed. Drake didn't want to marry her. He just wanted to sleep with her. Grace snapped back. Typical language from you, Jessie. I didn't respect you. I thought you were beneath her. But after she married you and had Polly, I saw she was happy. I started to think I was wrong about you. She continued, her voice softening. Then you left her and Polly. I was furious. Heather was devastated, but she wouldn't let me blame you. She even snapped at me whenever I talked badly about you. I didn't understand it. I was getting impatient. No surprise there, Grace. Heather didn't let you badmouth me, and you didn't know why. Grace cut me off with a wave of her hand, her eyes flashing with anger. Heather told me the truth. She explained how you stood up to Drake and how his friends jumped you after you punched him in self-defense. Later, I heard from one of Drake's buddies that they threatened to eliminate you if you tried to stop them from taking Heather. I was surprised she knew that much. I hadn't thought anyone knew what was said in the parking lot, but it didn't change what happened. So, you know, Heather caused all this by her actions. She chose to party instead of staying loyal to me. When I left, I believed she was with Drake, and I couldn't stay here if that was true. No one saw her that night, and she didn't come home until the afternoon the next day. Where was she? Did she ever tell you? Grace seemed shocked and shook her head, clearly not knowing. Well, now you know. She went out without me, drank too much, and ended up at the bar with Drake. When I confronted her, she laughed at me. I could have handled the knocking, but the humiliation of what was going to happen was too much. I believe she spent the night with him. This reminded me of the time I proposed to Heather, and I suddenly realized it was the same situation. She probably spent the night with Drake back then, too, only to come back to me, acting innocent. Grace needed to know that part of the story as well. As I sat down in the old chair I used to relax in, I prepared myself to hear Grace out. I didn't care much about what she thought of me, but I was ready to listen, knowing she'd want to blame me. Go ahead, Grace, say what you need to. I know you never thought I was good enough for Heather. Grace frowned, but began. I need to tell you what happened that night and afterward. You left, and Heather and Polly went through a lot. You have no idea. I never thought you were right for her. I always believed she'd marry someone like Drake, wealthy, well-connected. But Heather always rejected him. She told me she'd rather die than marry him. I laughed. Drake didn't want to marry her. He just wanted to sleep with her. Grace snapped. You always disrespect her. I never respected you either. But after you two married and had Polly, I saw how happy Heather was. I started to think maybe I was wrong. Her tone softened as she continued. Then you left, and I was furious with you. But Heather wouldn't let me speak badly of you. She was heartbroken. I didn't understand it. I was getting impatient, but Grace pressed on. Heather told me the truth later. She explained how you stood up to Drake that night and only punched him in self-defense. Then, his friends attacked you. After you were knocking, they threatened you in the parking lot, saying they'd eliminate you if you tried to stop them from taking Heather. I was surprised she knew the details, but didn't let it change my perspective. So, you know, Heather brought all this on herself. She went out without me, drank too much, and ended up with Drake. When I saw her laughing at me that night, it was clear she had made her choice. I left because I believed she spent the night with him. Grace looked startled and shook her head, seemingly unsure of what had happened that night. Well, now you know. Heather chose to be with Drake. She humiliated me, and I couldn't stay here. I believe she stayed with him that night. And this wasn't the first time. I then recounted the night I proposed, realizing Heather may have already been involved with Drake even then. Grace, calmer now, said, "You're wrong. Heather told me she never liked Drake. He always chased her, but she never wanted him. She even asked his dad to make him stop. She loves you, Jesse. She's unhappy now, and the only thing she cares about is Polly. She goes out with her friends occasionally, but she always comes home early. She's been saving every penny you send for Polly's future and hasn't touched any of the money you two saved." Grace stood, grabbing her purse. "I'm leaving now, Jesse. You'll have to stay with Polly until Heather returns. I'll take the van and she'll bring it back tomorrow. The van's in bad shape without you to keep it running. Good night, Jesse." Before I could respond, she left, leaving me no choice but to wait for Heather. As I sat there, I thought about what Grace said. It didn't add up. I knew the van had been in perfect condition when I left, and Heather didn't need to work. What I sent her was more than enough to live on. If she had money, why hadn't she bought a new car? It was hard to believe she wasn't going out and partying like before. Grace didn't know everything, and Heather had been good at fooling her mother in the past. I tried to figure out how I wanted to confront Heather. Needing a distraction, I went to check on Polly again. She was still peacefully asleep, and I felt a wave of emotion seeing her. I stayed by her side until the clock struck 1. Heather still hadn't come home, which didn't surprise me. I assumed she was with Drake, probably at the hospital after the bar fight. Just as I was debating getting something to eat, I heard a car pull up. It was Grace's car, followed by an older Mercedes, the same one I had delivered earlier to Drake's father. Heather got out of Grace's car, and a man from the Mercedes handed her something, probably the keys. He then walked back to the waiting car, and Heather waved as it drove off. As Heather came in, I could see she had changed. She was slimmer, her hair longer and shinier, and she wore a much shorter, tighter dress than she used to. Her face had the starry-eyed look she always got after a night of drinking and dancing. This wasn't the sad, unhappy woman Grace had described. "Hello, Jesse. It's been a long time. How are you?" she said softly, a tone I didn't recognize. I wasn't sure what to say. This was a different Heather, more like the one I knew before we got married. I had to be careful. "Hello, Heather. I'm fine. It's been over 2 years since I was here last, the night you went out partying without me. I'm sure you remember." She sat on the couch, took off her coat, and looked at me. "Yes, Jesse. I remember that night. I can't forget it. I see you in my mind getting dragged outside. That's all I remember before Jake and Janie pulled me out the back door." That was the first lie. I knew now how she was going to play this, so I decided to push her a little. "They knocked me pretty badly that night, Heather. A concussion, broken ribs, and bruises. And after they knocked me out, they told me, 'Your wife belongs to Drake tonight. You'll get her back tomorrow.' They said if I tried to get you, they'd drive me into the lake. That's what happened, Heather. I watched her, but she didn't react. I wasn't going to die for you, since you'd chosen Drake. So I went home and waited. You never came back. Never called, not a word. By morning, I realized you'd been with him all night, and I couldn't live with that shame. So I left." Tears welled in her eyes as she listened, but when she broke down crying, I could see they weren't real. Her eyes still held contempt. "Nothing happened, Jesse. I was with Jake and Janie the whole time. I tried to call you but couldn't get through. By the time they brought me back to the trailer, you were gone." I shook my head. "Why would you expect me to stay? You went to that bar with Drake, sat with him, and let him touch you. You smiled when you saw me." It was a smile of satisfaction. "I waited all night for you, Heather. You never called, and Jake told me you didn't leave with them. They didn't see you again until the next day. You're lying." She looked away, trembling, but I continued. "As I waited in the trailer that night, I remembered the time I was going to propose to you. You were with Drake then, too, and I trusted you when you said nothing happened. But now I see I was a fool to believe you. That's why I left." "Oh, God, Jesse," she whispered. "I was the fool. That night at the apartment, I was telling the truth. The only mistake I made was teasing Drake by saying I loved you. I wasn't going to let him into my apartment. I let him touch me earlier to make him less suspicious, but I was trying to keep him out. When you showed up, that's what you saw. I swear I was telling the truth." Heather took a deep breath and continued. "That night of the party, I messed up. I was angry and wanted to hurt you, but not by doing anything with Drake, just by making you jealous. I wasn't drunk, just a little tipsy, and I knew what I was doing. When I smiled, it was because I was happy you finally came for me. But when Drake got up and rushed at you, I realized everything was going wrong. That wasn't what I planned. I was so shocked I just sat there. And before I knew it, everything went to hell. The next thing I remember, I was at my parents' house. The next morning, I understood what I had done. You were gone, and I realized what you must have thought. She wiped her eyes, sniffling. I knew I had driven you away, and I couldn't find you. Polly cried herself to sleep for weeks, and I had no way to comfort her. I couldn't tell her I drove you away. I never stopped loving you, Jesse, and I haven't been with anyone else since you left. All the money you sent has been saved for Polly. I've lived here waiting for you to come back. Now that you're here, I've said everything. It's up to you now. All I want is your forgiveness and for you to come back to me and our daughter. I sat in disbelief at the lies she told so easily. Heather had spent the night with Drake at least twice that I knew of. Once when I almost proposed, and the night of the party. Likely more. She was always good at lying, and tonight was no different. She crafted her story to fit what she wanted me to believe. Heather had made her choices, going out without me, sitting with Drake, drinking too much, and expecting me to come rescue her without consequences. When things spiraled out of control, she spent the night with Drake. She always had feelings for him, but chose me because she knew Drake wasn't husband material. When things got boring, she found a way to have both. She caused my knocking and my decision to leave, but hadn't she paid a price? I moved on, found a new life, good friends, and even a potential new relationship with Sean. Meanwhile, Heather had the chance to tell me the truth tonight and instead lied. Her regrets felt hollow. There was no chance I'd go back to her. I made up my mind. Heather, that car you came home in, it's Drake's old car. He gave it to you. The other car in the driveway is the one I delivered to Drake's father this morning. His dad told me Drake is with a woman whose husband ran off after cheating. Her eyes widened as she started to speak, but I silenced her. You were with Drake the night I almost proposed. And again at the party. Even your mother didn't know where you were that night. She believes your lies, just like everyone else. You claim you tried to reach me, but my phone never rang. Why lie, Heather? Let's be real. I made a mistake marrying you, but I'm over it. Once a cheater, always a cheater, right? Heather's tears were real this time as I confronted her with her lies. I saw shock turn into fear and finally into genuine pain. She knew it was truly over. Why are you crying, Heather? You ended things the night you cheated on me in front of everyone. You had to know that. Before, you hid it, and I either didn't notice or refused to believe it. But that night, you made it public. You knew I'd never accept you with Drake. Or any other man. I'm sorry, Jesse. I was angry, had too much to drink, and made a stupid mistake. Drake means nothing to me. You're the only man I've ever loved. Please forgive me. No, Heather, I don't owe you forgiveness. It wasn't just a mistake, and it wasn't the first time you were with him, even before we were married. Now, I don't even know if Polly is mine. Your lies and deceit are too much. She sobbed harder. No, Jesse, Polly is yours. I don't love Drake, and I'm not with him. He just gave me the car to help us. I've never been with him. You're wrong. I shook my head. I'm not wrong, Heather. You've lied to everyone, including your mother, Jake, and Janie. I believed you back then, but that was my mistake. You were always drawn to parties, and Drake had money. You spent the night with him when I was going to propose and came back pretending nothing happened. I was blind because I loved you. Her tears flowed, but I felt no sympathy. But I see through it now. You've cheated on me and I'm done. Tomorrow I'll be gone and I'll file for divorce as soon as I get back. I stared into her eyes. And I'll get a DNA test to make sure Polly is mine. If it's not, I'll sue you for fraud. Heather's face paled as she whispered, Why, Jesse, why would you think that? I've waited for you all this time, raising our daughter, saving everything you sent. Do you think I've been lying? Yes, Heather, I do. You've always lied. If you cared, you wouldn't have gone behind my back with Drake. It's too late now. I stood, ready to leave. You can keep everything. The money, the trailer. I just want to forget it all, but I'll demand time with Polly. If you fight that, I'll take you and Drake down. I'll agree to child support, but not alimony. I won't give you a dime for him. You can call me when you're ready for me to take Polly. She'll just hold you back. As I turned to leave, I heard a small voice. Daddy, is that you? I looked down and saw Polly, her wide eyes staring at me. My heart sank. Yes, baby. It's Daddy. Hi, Daddy. Are you going to come home and live with us again? I hesitated, looking at her and Heather. No, Pumpkin. I'm leaving tomorrow. But I'll visit you as often as I can, okay? Tears filled her eyes. Why can't you stay, Daddy? I knelt down. Mommy and I aren't going to be together anymore, but I'll still see you, I promise. Heather, now composed, added, "That's right, sweetie. Daddy will visit you often." As I held back my emotions, I felt a tug of old affection. I hugged Heather one last time, her fragile frame clinging to me. She whispered, "I'm so sorry, Jesse. Can you ever forgive me?" I pulled back. "No, Heather. I'll never forgive you for destroying my relationship with Polly. I'll stay civil, but when she's old enough, I'll make sure she knows the truth about you." Her face reflected the horror of my words, but I forced a smile. "Take care of her. I'll send everything soon. Once I loved you with everything I had, but now it's too late." Heather sobbed. "I don't know how I'll survive without you. I believed you'd come back. I never stopped loving you." I sighed. "I don't care anymore. As for Polly, I love her, but I need proof she's mine. Maybe you'll let her visit me. She'll like Sean and Billy. They're waiting for me now." I kissed Polly's forehead, gave Heather one last look, and walked out. In my car, I stopped the recording on my phone and sent it to her mother and Jake. So much for lies. As I drove away, I saw Heather watching from the doorway. I waved goodbye, my only thought, "Sean, I'm coming home."